Okay, welcome back. I'd like to pick up where we left. So we had looked at Mesopotamia and Egypt as the two earliest and most outstanding examples of riverine civilization. Let me get this. Yeah, it's a little bit better. Okay, thank you. So we're going to look at a third example of riverine civilization that is not entirely contemporaneous with, certainly not at the start. It comes a little bit later, and it is the Indus River Valley Civilization, often referred to as the Harappan civilization or Harappan culture, because Harappa was the major city there. Okay, look a little bit better. Not that you care. But what do we got here? Okay, so recent work in archaeology has indicated that, and again, I think based on the textbook, which does it, but not as much, certainly as Jared Diamond did, the origins of civilization are certainly closely tied to the origins of food production. Hence, for some scholars, the food production revolution, even though, yes, as we've seen, Jared Diamond really wanted to look at it as a extended process, and you can't really have a revolution unless you are trying to change what you have, A, by replacing it with B. But since people at the start of this process were just sort of experimenting with minor steps from one step leading to another, and it's going to take them several thousand years, a relatively long process. Certainly not a revolution from a temporal standpoint. Something that takes several thousand years is a process of minute changes scattered around the globe. May not be considered a revolution. I would suggest, however, and since you've probably by this time written an essay on this topic, I do think it is somewhat revolutionary that you can use the word revolution, if not in the sense that Jared Diamond is talking about and sort of refuting, if you will, but certainly in the sense of an incredibly significant shift in the nature of human existence on this planet. And in that sense, it is truly revolutionary, right? And again, it depends upon the time scale you're looking at and things like that, right? Okay, so we jump over to the Indus River Valley in what today would be Pakistan. The Indus River runs through the middle of Pakistan today, and there are five tributary rivers coming down out of the mountains that feed into this river. And indeed, what's going to happen with this civilization is it's going to spread and use this whole panorama of rivers to create what will indeed be the largest and most extensive of these early civilizations in terms of the mass of land that it covers, and quite possibly the total number of people, although it's really hard to compare the Indus River Valley with Egypt, with the two sides of the Nile River becoming increasingly populated over time. Okay, so let's go back again. This begins to the west of the Indus River Valley in what is now called the Iranian Plateau, which will have a process of growth and development of agriculture similar to what we've seen in the Fertile Crescent. This is, however, a probably a secondary in the sense of influenced by cultigens and a knowledge of the process coming out of Mesopotamia, moving into Iran, and then bringing down here. And what we have then is, as these farming villages begin to grow their population, split off, send out, new communities to form, they increasingly approach the land on the banks of the river, when they get there, we will have the same phenomena that we've seen before. So the Indus River Valley and the Indus River and its tributaries all receive their waters from snow on the tops of the mountains with the change of the seasons. The snow melts, comes down, picks up silt as it goes, and indeed will come down into these plains surrounding the river. As they come down from the mountains with force, they will jump out of the banks, and indeed will do what we've seen happening in Mesopotamia, um, in the Nile River Valley, certainly in China, the Yellow and the Yangtze rivers do the same kinds of things. When we the Europeans arrive in the Mississippi River Valley, we will discover the same result: um, deep, rich earth formed by the floods of the Mississippi River, which still continue to plague us today, but whose benefits were agricultural lands that were extremely productive for um, years and years. And we're only getting to the point now where we seem to be perhaps exhausting those riches that were built up over millennia in the form of the fertile soils in the Mississippi River Valley, and we have been so exhausting them and pulling them out one crop after another. And of course, when you grow a crop, that crop sucks nutrients out of the soil, and then eventually, as will happen in Sumeria, the Sumerian agricultural riches that we've seen stimulate this early civilization that gives us writing and systems of governance and things like that, will come to a point somewhere around 2000 BC, where salt has built up in those areas that had been so rich before, because they were farming them and farming them and farming them. And eventually they left the land infertile. And that's a point at which civilization shifts to the northern reaches that we've already seen in a figure like Sargon of Akkad in 2350, who will come down and conquer those regions, right, and create something like the First Empire. Let's go back here. Okay, so the banks of the Indus River and its tributaries are forming another riverine civilization: melting snows, yearly floods, overflowing of banks, silt, replenishing the soil, surplus production, the whole sort of, shall we say, formula. Surplus production leads to population growth, leads to the emergence of cities, right? And ends up producing the largest expansion of riverine civilization up to this point. By 2500 BC, so somewhere around 2800 BC, something like that, 27, 28, we start seeing the arrival of people on the banks of the rivers in these different areas and starting to farm that area. The book indicates that there have been archaeological finds that indicate the presence of furrows, like that in the field, that would come from having plowed them, right? And they're able to date it back to about 2600 BCE. Now, apparently, these people only had arrived there, 100, 150 years before, but given the richness of the soil, this it took off. It exploded rather quickly, but it exploded rather quickly in an unusual fashion, right? So effectively, the landmass covered by this will be 2 to 3 times larger than what we had in Mesopotamia. And remember, Egypt is not large in terms of the expanse, because I explained to you, irrigation from the river can only extend out maybe a half a mile on either side, but the Nile itself extends for hundreds of miles to the south, rises up until it comes to the border with Sudan, where there are water rapids that sort of separated Egypt off. Okay, so before we get into the nitty gritty of Harappan city life, um, there is a problem that we have with this particular civilization. The first is the factor of since around the year 2000, 1900 BC, which gives us only 5, 6, maybe 700 years at most of sort of this urban civilization in this area, and this sort of coordinated civilization over such a large area, it seems to collapse there. And we'll maybe talk about that a little bit later, right? But it seems to collapse there, right? And subsequent to that time, populations moved out, moved to different areas. We're not entirely sure what happened, right? This is one of the, shall we say, for the countries of India and Pakistan today, contemporary countries, the destiny of the Harappan civilization and why it fell is one of those historical issues that separates two countries, Pakistan on one side and India on the other, where Pakistan is the heartland of what is the Indus River Valley Civilization. India, on the other hand, will become the heartland of the Ganges River civilization of sorts that develops in India afterwards. I will try and touch on this later then. So, first challenge to understanding this civilization is the fact that so much of the archaeological data is buried under, feet and feet of silt that is built up over the last 4,000 years, right? In addition to which, the rivers have changed directions. It's hard to locate these things, right? And so the sheer archaeological task has been challenged. Cities have been eaten away by the floods over time, right? And what had been, civilization bordering the river itself will eat away at it. So much of it has been lost that it's hard to archaeologically reproduce it, right? Because the stuff just isn't there anymore. So that's one thing, right? The impact of time, the flow of the river, the growth of silt, the eating away of things, right? The second, which may be even more important and significant from the perspective that we've been developing in this course. Remember, we said that history and prehistory are separated by the emergence of writing systems. And so to have the academic discipline of history, you need to have writing systems, you need to have documentation that provides you with the sort of the factual infrastructure that you then rely on. And you rely on it and you interpret it, and we've been trying to work on that. Had you well, we haven't really done that yet, but it's a challenge in and of itself that written documents can be highly biased. They reflect the culture of the time, their sense of what's important and what's not. Is obviously something that is temporally driven and culturally driven and things like that, right? So with that in mind, we have not been able to, not that I'd get involved in this, but people studying the Indus River Valley have not been able to find clear examples of writing, nor have they been able to decipher what they assume may be snippets or parcels of writing, but they can't be sure. And even more than that, they don't even know what the language was that these people actually spoke and used. You know, there is in contemporary India today the belief that um, Dravidian, which is a language family that you find in the south, particularly the southwest of India, um, may be the equivalent language family of that group, but there's nothing hard and definitive about that. And your book suggests it, and suggests that in that piece called, what is it? The Mystery of Harappan Writing, right? Which is worth a read, right? They suggest that it may be an agglutinative language, like Turkish is an agglutinative language where you have a base and you add suffixes to it. Can't imagine how that would work, but apparently there are some Indian Native American languages that follow that format of structure and building up a sentence where you start with a core word and you add things to it. And um, I, I can't imagine how it works, right? But scholars who work in the field say, it may have been a Dravidian language, but all we have then are these snippets. And in fact, on page, what is it, 62, um, we have this, and I'll give you a quick look at it. These things on page 62, which the book says are Harappan seal stamps that you can stamp in wax and things like that. Um, and whether those are examples of writing is really hard to tell, or whether they are sort of like, like a logo for a company, right? Like Mercedes Benz's, the things on the front of cars that you can see and identify the car. Whether they were something like that, identifiers that were sort of the emblem of individuals, individual families, whatever. It's hard to say. We just don't know. So, in effect, in trying to talk about the city life of a place like this, um, we don't have any written sources. So, how do you talk about family organization? How do you talk about religion? How do you talk about politics and things like that? If indeed there are no systems of documentation. So, here in this particular instance, even though we're looking at a true and indeed a very successful riverine civilization, we lack writing. And in the absence of writing, we must rely entirely on the archaeological um, data. And as I suggested, even that has been challenged because of the forces of nature that have gradually eroded and eaten away at what might have been a more complete picture, albeit a picture without words, as it were, right? But in any case, let's look at it, right? Okay. So, one of the first things that the book mentions in regard to this lack of writing, and certainly in comparison with the two civilizations that we've just seen, and especially Egypt with its dynastic, um, its list of kings, the king's list, and the pharaohs, things like that, and dynasties and all that kind of stuff, right? Even though we've been forced to go back and reinterpret it um, based on the fact that apparently when it was written up, they would cluster things together. And with time and using a variety of sort of external measures, right? astrological signs and stuff like that, dating them, and to be able to sort of decipher and separate them out. And as I also suggested to you, bringing in students of climate and climate change who have indicated that the so-called, in Egypt, the interdynastic periods may well correspond to droughts in Africa that meant that there weren't the floods that they were used to in Egypt, um, and all of the consequences of that. The collapse of the Pharaoh, who, after all, claimed to be the source of the rivers of life of the Nile. And when the Nile doesn't flood, who do you blame? But the guy who's claiming credit for it. We'll see. Okay. Hence, as a result of that there are no king lists or anything like that, scholars of the Indus River Valley um, cannot chart Harappan political history. And indeed, when we move into the archaeological finds, it's even stranger in that regard. Okay, so our knowledge is based primarily on archaeological reconstructions, hence it's sketchy. Um, and the text gives you an interesting expression. It says, and I want you to listen, history is not what happened, but only what we know about what happened. So we never get a complete history, right? They were always approximations. And for this reason, whenever you find new sources of information, and usually primary sources of information, right? History can change, which would seem to be absurd. How can history change? It's happened, it's written, it's done, right? But it can change when suddenly we get new perspectives on it. And so we're facing a challenge here. We don't know a hell of a lot, but still we know a lot about the layout of Harappan cities and towns. And these cities and towns, excuse me, these cities and towns throughout this really vast area, right? I think the text gives us something like 500,000 square miles. The cities and towns that are spread out seem to have a uniformity. And we'll touch on that in a second, right? So these cities and towns followed a well-planned pattern. So they consist of a fortified citadel. So I said, okay, well, I have to model for students what a scholar should do. So I looked at the word citadel and I had an idea in my head. I said, no, let me Google it. And I Googled it. Okay. So in Googling it, I came up with, right, first of all, a citadel, it means a tiny city, which is referring to a cluster, sort of a core, might be a good way of putting it, a core dense area in the heart of these cities and towns. But it says that it is a core fortified area of a town or a city, which will have something like a castle, a fortress, or a fortified center, creating, if you will, this idea of a little city. So let's go back. It's a well-planned pattern which starts with a fortified citadel, and this fortified citadel and this core area houses a variety of public facilities and is next to a large residential area. So the cities seem to be planned and laid out and follow a common pattern. They have a main street drainage, a covered drainage, on both sides of the main street. So the street runs down the middle, okay, and it's able to receive carts and other things, right? And on either side, there are these drainage ditches that are covered and sort of um, channel the water around and out of the city itself. Um, Now, I just want to mention in passing that, um, this is, it suggests a really sort of high level of skill, a level of sort of organization, um, cultural and social organization, right? Um, I've I haven't seen Machu Picchu. My wife went there with my two sons. My daughter didn't go. Yeah, with my two sons, and they, because my wife has a sister who is married to a gentleman from Peru, and she lives in the capital. But of course, they wanted to go up into the mountains and visit the famous Inca mountain towns, and particularly Machu Picchu. And they went to Machu Picchu. But I've certainly seen enough films about it. Machu Picchu is sort of built on a sort of an escarpment that runs down like this, and it's in an area that gets a lot of rainfall, and the streets indeed have very much like this carved into the rocks channels that channel the water down over the face at the end and down the face of the mountain into the valley below. I've also lived in the city of Tehran. Tehran in Iran is built on the side of a mountain, slopes up. You go from the lowlands at the bottom where there's camel market and things like that. And then as you move up and then move further up the mountains, you get into wealthier and wealthier areas, enclosed gardens, things like that. And in the main avenues coming down from the mountains, there are jubes, which are the same kind of thing that you have here, right? Um, Canalization, channels built that run as drainage ditches next to the streets and that are covered with sort of like metal topping, like we would put, you go over the subway in New York City, and there'll be areas like that where you can look down through the metal, but you can walk along, and it's kind of like that, right? So it is interesting to see in the contemporary world cities today that are using some of the ideas that were already developed in the Harappan civilization so long ago, right? And what's interesting is the the main street runs like this, with the drainage next to it, and then there is like a pathway to walk on it, and there are walls in it, but then there are alleyways that will take you around. So the door to the house doesn't front on the main street, it fronts around the back. You go around the back to go in. It's very, very interesting. The houses themselves, these people had baked bricks and made marvelous houses. These houses had internal bathrooms, plumbing. They had showers, toilets, all of which drained out into the central drainage, the water drainage system for the underground water drainage system. They had municipal sewers. Now, one other thing that I think is interesting, and if you have your book, so we looked at 62. If you look at 61, this is one of the two major cities, right? It's called Mohenjo-Daro, which is the city of the dead, or the mound of the dead. And if you take a look at it, you get an idea of what I'm going to be saying now. That what's extraordinary is virtually every one of these cities that we have excavated, we being archaeologists, that people have excavated, are laid out in a grid fashion with seemingly avenues and streets, just like Manhattan, right? So you have avenues that go north and south, and you have streets numbered, from one up to whatever it is, running crosswise from east to west. You have this same grid-like system in these towns um, located up in the hinterlands, just like in the big cities, which makes it really kind of interesting, right? Uh, in addition to which, having gone in and not only excavated but sort of dug in the ground in these places to see if there are artifacts in the dirt. One of the things we've discovered is these towns and cities are laid out in let's see this one here. They are laid out in this fashion that you know house here, house, house on either side, house on either side. All of these, say 5, 6 houses, right, have got connecting walls. They all have um, remains of the activities that were being done there. One of the biggest activities is in the working of gems. Now, certainly there were some places that were more into this than other places, but if we look at Harappa itself, Harappa had a major thoroughfare that divided up gem workers from other, from um, tailors, from ceramics, right? So that the way the cities seem to be organized is they placed next to each other people practicing the same trade, and then a street up you'll have the same thing with houses and the same kind of a thing, right? Now, one other thing that I would like to suggest here, let me see if I covered everything. Um, in analyzing the materials that we find, and what archaeologists do now is they use, really sophisticated modern systems. So if they find a specific gem, they are often able to identify the source, the mine from which this gem came. And so they have gradually worked out a framework of internal trade all across this region, and indeed with feelers extending out. And when we went out there, the archaeologists would often discover some sort of like a trade post kind of a situation, right? And so this whole area was designed as a sort of a central grid for manufacturing and trading, right? It is probably the first example of a civilization like this that is so totally tied to commerce, trade. And one last item that they have in this regard that's really extraordinary in the terms of how this culture, if you will, has spread over this large area. They all use the same system of weights and measures, right? Um, okay, so we have kind of like a coordinated, organized system, a way of organizing commerce, trade, the way we organize our cities ourselves, right? All of these kinds of things. Yet at the same time, there are really no clear indications of political centralization. There are no kings, there are no palaces, there are no royal tombs. There are wealthier areas of town and less wealthier, sort of working class areas of town. Yet at the same time, there is no indication of structured systems of power that we associate with civilization, and we tend to associate with Mesopotamia and Egypt. We don't seem to have that here. And I ask myself, and you could probably ask yourself the same thing, how is it possible to have a coordinated and centralized seeming system of life in the absence of, of governance, in the absence of a government that imposes laws like the Code of Hammurabi, things like that, right? Is this a civilization that is coordinated through trade, through commerce? Is this a really unique and different model of it? I mean, the text ends its discussion of this area by saying, isn't this interesting? Our first three examples of riverine civilizations all have the same material infrastructure that makes them possible. Yet at the same time, they end up producing radically different ways of life and cultures in them. Very, very interesting. Okay, I do have a little bit of time. Okay, so I mentioned this earlier on, right? In the next lecture I'm going to do, which is about India, but it's from the next chapter, and it's really not a direct continuation of the Indus River Valley, but the movement out of the Indus River Valley to the Ganges River. Let me just give you a word that maybe you might have heard, but probably never looked it up, right? Historiography. And I believe if you looked at the learning objectives for this course, it mentions historiography. Now, historiography has sort of two slightly different but connected meanings. The first is the process of writing history, right? And we've mentioned it as we go along here and there, right? But there's a second meaning that I especially like, right? Which is this. What is history? Okay, so history is things in the past. And we heard that sentence today about, we only know what we know, we can't know, we can't know. These kinds of things, right? But what is history? It is an intrinsically human activity in which we take documents from the past to try and understand the past so we know where we came from, how we got here, right? Okay, right? So what I'm trying to say is history, the writing of history, is a human activity. Just like fighting a battle. Just like going to the market and buying something. Just like getting married, having kids, raising a family. Human activities. And so history is a compilation of human activities that we, for one reason or another, see them as being significant and important to the structure of the framework that we're trying to, write about and tell you and this kind of a thing, right? So if the writing of history is an activity, a human activity in time, what does that mean? We can write the history of writing history. What does that mean? We can go back. Okay, let me give you this example. The French Revolution, 1789. The King of France needs funding for his many wars. In fact, he just spent a boatload of money helping those roughnecks in North America gain their freedom from his enemy, the King of England, right? And he turns to the nobles and he says, you got to help me out. And the nobles say, well, we can't just agree to that. You must have a meeting of what's called the Estates General, which is kind of a medieval institution that hadn't met for 115 years, something like that. 150, I don't remember, 165 years. Let me see, 1789, I think it was like 1615 or something like that, the last time it met, um, because that was the law, right? Only the Estates General, which is a meeting of the whole society, could, in effect, grant the king the right to raise taxes, um, especially on the aristocrats and the nobles, who are indeed the only ones who really know that this is the case, right? And so in May of 1789, I think it was May 10th, something like that, people start gathering in Versailles to start what will become one of the great revolutionary moments. Talk about the word revolution in human history, certainly in Western history, right? Now, because the French Revolution is so important, and it's going to lead to Napoleon and the Napoleonic Wars and all the things that happen in Europe, right? Um, People write histories of the French Revolution. And one historian I read, in an article said the French Revolution tends to produce one new history of the French Revolution every 10 years. Someone comes along and decides we need to look at this. But those different iterations, those different histories of the French Revolution reflect the ideas of society behind them. And you can see the changing perception of society in regard to the meaning of the French Revolution, its importance, why it happened, who was responsible, who did what, right? Um, and so you could sit down and write a book about the changing meanings of the French Revolution by reading all of those different um, versions. But you could do the same thing with the American Revolution. Um, Historiography is that art of studying the writing of history and how history changes in time in response to the forces of society. So, indeed, if you took a history of the American Revolution written in 1800 and written in 1820 and written in 1850 and written in 1870, you might see the changing perception of what happened, what was important, based on changes in the society behind it. This has been happening with the issue of the Indus River Valley and the Ganges River. The Ganges will, as we will see, be settled by what are called Aryans, Indo-European speakers, and we'll have to talk about that, right? Did they conquer the Indus River Valley, or did they arrive after the Indus River Valley had reached its peak and was already on the decline? Depends on which side of the fence you're on, how you see these things. So that's a topic in historiography today that I can't go into anymore because I want to let you go. I'm sure you got better things to do than listen to me. All right. So I will post a second one that covers, it's listed on the, what is it? It's chapter 3, pages 85 to 101. That looks at a later stage, the growth of what today is Hindu civilization in India. Okay, guys, be good.